I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of contemporary poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings in our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/Pen Sound. Today, for a very special Poem Talk, we are recording before a live audience, both an in-person audience here in the Arts Cafe of the Kelly Writers House in Philadelphia, USA, and a massive by-live webcast audience of hundreds and possibly thousands joining us through the open online course called ModPo. And just to make sure listeners to Poem Talk always and forever know that we are/were here with a live audience, I'll ask them to put their hands together and thank our three poets for joining us. Thank you. And those three poets joining me for this Poem Talk are Julia Bloch, teacher. She's looking at the intro. Don't look at the intro. Teacher, brilliant co-convener of online poetry communities, associate director of this very Kelly Writers House, beloved ModPo mentor, fabulously talented editor, a widely published poet, author of Post-Psychiatric Sonnets. Boy, I could use a few post-psychiatric sonnets. Will you let me in on those? I've actually read them and I feel much better. And a series of letters to Kelly Clarkson, a book that I very much recommend, and who, along with Michael Hennessy, is the editor of Jacket 2 magazine. And Amy King, brilliant and energetic and much admired editor of several magazines and moderator of several crucial poetry community listservs. You're still doing that, aren't you?
Somehow.
I know what that's like. And is one of the founders of VITA, Women in Literary Arts. It's a site I highly recommend and a project, and has been aptly named Poet Laureate of the Blogosphere, and a poet whose books include Antidotes for an Alibi, I'm the Man Who Loves You, Slaves to Do These Things, and I Want to Make You Safe. And thirdly, I'm thrilled to say Tom Pickard, who was born in Newcastle upon Tyne in England, a poet, documentary filmmaker, and one of the main inspirers of the movement sometimes known as the British Poetry Revival, and this is an understatement, we could say a lot about that, who met Basil Bunting at 17 years old, when you were 17, not Basil, and that's for sure, and was key to Bunting's return to poetry, whose books of poems, Tom's I mean, too long to list, include Hole in the Wall, New and Selected Poems, The Dark Months of May, The Ballad of Jamie Allen, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the partly autobiographical More Pricks Than Prizes of 2010. Thank you, Tom, for making the trip all the way here. We're really honored to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And Amy, thanks for making the trip from New York.
Thank you. It was just a train right away.
I know, come often.
He jumped a pond.
He jumped a pond, you got on Amtrak. I don't know which is harder, actually.
I crossed a bridge.
You crossed a bridge, Julia. You make my day every time I see you, which is every day, and so my days have been made.
Thanks, Al.
We're here today to talk about Walt Whitman's famous poem, Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking, or at least the opening sections of the poem, possibly also the final section of the poem, as they were performed and recorded by the aforementioned great and influential poet Basil Bunting. Bunting's Pensout page includes recordings of the poet performing as Rapound, Edmund Spencer, Louis Zukofsky, Thomas Wyatt, and Whitman at a reading he gave at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in 1977. Whitman's famous poem was first published in 1859 and first included in the 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass, and he tinkered with it as the years went on, but it was basically intact by 1860. So here now, we will listen to Basil Bunting performing the opening of Walt Whitman's Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking.
Out of the cradle, endlessly rocking, out of the mockingbird's throat, the musical shuttle, out of the 9th month midnight, over the sterile sands and the fields beyond, where the child, leaving his bed, wandered alone, bare-headed, barefoot, down from the showered halo, up from the mystic play of shadows, twining and twisting as if they were alive. Out from the patches of briars and blackberries, from the memories of the bird that chanted to me, from your memories, sad brother, from the fitful risings and fallings I heard, from under that yellow half-moon, late risen and swollen as if with tears, from those beginning notes of yearning and love there in the mist, from the thousand responses of my heart never to cease, from the myriad thence aroused words, from the words stronger and more delicious than any, from such as now they start the scene revisiting as a flock twittering, rising, or overhead passing, borne hither ere all eludes me hurriedly, a man, yet by these tears a little boy again, throwing myself on the sand, confronting the waves, I, chanter of pains and joys, uniter of here and hereafter, taking all hints to use them, but swiftly leaping beyond them, a reminiscence sing. Once, Beaumanoc, when the lilac scent was in the air, and 5th month grass was growing, up this seashore in some briars, 2 feathered guests from Alabama, 2 together, and their nest, and 4 light green eggs spotted with brown, and every day the he-bird to and fro near at hand, and every day the she-bird crouched on her nest, silent with bright eyes, and every day I, a curious boy, never too close, never disturbing them, cautiously peering, absorbing, translating.
So we've listened to the first 2 sections of a 10-section poem. Tom, can I start with you? What does it sound like? Bunting cared about sound. This is to say the obvious. What do you think I was about to say saw? What did he hear in Whitman that attracted him, do you think?
Well, there's a sort of history really that you maybe ought to be aware of. Basil, it's a fairly well-known story. When Basil was 15 years old in 1915, and he was attending a Quaker school somewhere in the Midlands, he found hidden behind the bookshelves a copy of Leaves of Grass. At that time, he claims, Whitman was somewhat disregarded in Britain and pretty well unknown. Bunting was very moved by the book. He wrote an essay which won a national prize. When notice of that prize was generalised, he had a visit from Edmund Carpenter, who pedalled across on his bicycle from Sheffield to see the young fellow who had this new young critic of Whitman. Carpenter, as you probably know, Ginsberg told me that Carpenter was a lover of Whitman. He's certainly a friend.
A lover, an actual lover.
That's what Alan said, but whether how he knows, I don't know. But that's what he told me anyway. And so from a very early age, Bunting had an association, a love of Whitman.
That's cool. Thank you for the context.
There is actually more to it, but I think I'm hogging too much of your time.
Well, let me throw it to Amy and back to Tom and Julia. What do you hear in Bunting's reading? I mean, I'm used to hearing Ginsberg read Whitman, and that's a different approach. What do you hear? What actually do you hear?
I'm the quintessential American who can't get over the accent. So I listened to it, but I think I emailed you that my association with hearing this poem read aloud is with a film, a not very long ago made film called LIE, Long Island Expressway, which is kind of fitting because Whitman is obviously from Long Island. So in terms of the bunting, I just hear it kind of goes with the lapping on the shore of the waves and the rhythm.
Yeah.
So that's there in Bunting's reading.
Yes, definitely.
So,
Julie, you want to add to that? Do you hear the sea?
I do, I really hear the rhythms, the like heavy beats and rhythms in these first two sections. And when I think about this poem as a kind of birth of the poet genre poem, I hear a reminiscent tone in Bunting's voice, a sort of looking back.
So let's, the four of us, collaborate very briefly on a little explanation of the story of this poem. What happens? I mean, you just started it, so why do you consider it to be a sort of poetic Bildungsroman or Künstlerroman, the portrait of the artist as a child having his first poetic experience? Well,
in terms of the poem's form, which I think sonically gets kind of drawn out by Bunting's reading, when you look at the syntax of that first section, it's all one big prepositional phrase. It's all out of, X, comma, out of Y, comma. You don't get to... Out of,
down, up, out from, etc.
It's these, it's just unending prepositions. And then finally, the last line of that first section, a reminiscence, sing, then separated by more words. So it's very clear that I am singing this reminiscence out of this place.
Okay, Amy and then Tom, can we just very briefly piece together, for someone who doesn't know the poem, what supposedly happens here? Amy, start us off.
Well, I mean, to segue with what Julie was saying, the reminiscence is him looking back on his time as a boy, and that starts with section 2, where we get to the boy who is visiting the birds on the island of Long Island, or Paumanok, as he calls it.
Long Island, right.
Yeah, which is the Native American.
And that second section begins with once, as in once upon a time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay.
And it's, the usual reading is, of course, that the boy is becoming aware through the symbolic value of the mockingbirds of his own poetic impulse by questioning and asking and becoming more aware of his scenery. And as he says later, the sweet hell within that he feels, the yearning that's mentioned in the first stanza. So
thank you, Amy. So, Tom, it seems to be the moment we're not getting quite yet in this when the female bird does not come back. It seems to coincide with the awakening through that death or loss, the awakening of not simply the writerly sense in Whitman, but an erotic sense. He seems to understand himself at that moment. Can you help us put those two things together? And also...
Probably not.
How is it... Well, let me focus the question. How is it that even in the first section, the bird song seems to be referred to as words? So the ocean and the birds seem to be putting the poem together here. So we have a poet and the ocean and the birds. Can you say anything about that whole issue?
Not really, but what I could say, what I began to think about when I read this poem and was with the boy. It reminded me actually of the seeds of brick flats, where Bunting's poem Brick Flats, where he, as an old man, is looking back to his childhood when he was a young fellow in love with a girl, and that's the whole basis of the poem thereafter. That very much reminded me of that. Yeah. And also, I mean, and I was thinking, he gave me one of the notebooks of Brick Flats many years ago in '65 when he'd finished it, and in the notebook, which is not in the final poem, there is a kind of calling out, as the male bird does in this in the Whitman poem. The male is it the male? It is the male.
The male is
the
calling,
male calling out all the time, and pretty much at the beginning of the Brick Flats manuscript, he has where he's kind of invoking the muse, if you like, or finding a way into what he has to say, and back before he met, the Peggy, the young woman of the poem. He has a section which is not dissimilar to other parts of the Whitman poem here, where the bird is calling out in the bunting. In his manuscript, he's saying things like, "Come to me, my love, come to me before dawn on the fells when the mist rises," and that kind of thing. Very much like, it's B-class bunting, but which is why he dropped it. But I pretty much felt a reflection of that in this.
Yeah, no doubt. And by the time he gets to 1977, when he's recording this must have been a resonance of Brig Flats, although all out of order, since Brig Flats precedes the recording of this. But
absolutely,
and Bunting, of course, there's that extraordinary pun in Bunting's name, because Bunting is a bird. And that's Brig Flats, for anybody who's hearing that title for the first time. A crucial document published in 1966.
Yeah, I think it was, or 1965 maybe.
Basil Bunting, Brig Flats, major work. So, Amy, take us from here. So, how is it that in the first stanza we get the beginning notes, the thence around words, from the word stronger, and then we get I, chanter. So there is an immediate association of the bird and the poet, which becomes very important. You want to say anything about that?
I'd like to say two things, actually. I think that one of the things this poem does with so much back and forth is Whitman is very good at conflating a lot of things. The I, the boy, the mockingbird, the symbolic value of love. And I wanted to kind of play off of what Tom was saying about Bunting's association with this poem, and Bunting writing about yearning for Peggy, his wife, I guess.
No, his love.
His love.
Which he never...
Right.
Whom he abandoned.
Right. There's a lot of push-pull that I see in here that, of course, I bring my own reading to this, which is a queer reading. And, Whitman himself throughout his life, especially in his later life, struggled with the whole homoerotic overtones and that sort of thing. I see this as not just the awakening and awareness of a poet, but also the struggle that he has with the homosexual feelings that he has and the acceptability. The fact that what happens in this poem is the female bird goes missing, and the boy becomes very closely aligned to this yearning that this male mockingbird constantly expresses, which is why I think he calls it a sweet hell, because there's so much yearning and so much desire, but it's not met. So I think it's really significant that the female bird disappears quite quickly, and Whitman kind of goes through, I know it's bad to conflate, but it's just there. It's just obvious to me.
No, it doesn't seem a conflation at all to me. Julia?
I really like what you're saying, Amy. It reminds me, too, of this word translating at the end of that second section, cautiously peering, absorbing, translating. And it's almost like, he very clearly identifies the birds as male and female, but there's a translating of the desire that's being expressed by the birds almost.
Right.
And their nest, and 4 light green eggs spotted with brown, and every day the he-bird to and fro near at hand, and every day the she-bird crouched on her nest, silent with bright eyes, and every day I, a curious boy, never too close, never disturbing them, cautiously peering, absorbing, translating.
So, disturbance, Tom, disturbance, the thing's already been disturbed in the narrative here, because at some point the female bird doesn't come back, and that's the disturbance. So, this curious boy
out of which he makes his song. Yeah.
Out of which he makes his song. Would you say more about that? The song comes from this disturbance and this longing and this feeling alone and this... What is the connection between this observation of the bird and the song itself, this work or the life of the poet?
I think it's just him acknowledging how, learning to sing himself, really, and kind of building his voice out of the landscape or out of the natural environment and finding his place in it. I think maybe it's him realizing that it is as natural for him to sing and think as it is for the bird to sing or the sea to have its tides.
Yeah, so
I think it's a oneness and approaching oneness with nature, you know.
Yeah, and one of the questions the poem raises is, what is natural? Is it natural for these two birds to be together? Is it natural for one of them not to come back and therefore a song to be created? Amy, can we focus on the end of the first section? I, chanter of pains and joys, uniter of here and hereafter, taking all hints to use them, but swiftly leaping beyond them, a reminiscence sing. We finally get the subject and verb at the end. But tell us about uniter of here and hereafter. How can the chanter unite here and hereafter? What does that mean?
I think this is Whitman kind of introducing the poet as the person who, is self-aware and works to become aware of things beyond just the status quo I think that what you see at the end, and I know you might play the end of this, is, the here and the hereafter is he's trying to change up what the idea of death is. Instead of death being the removal of consciousness of life, he wants to, he's the poet of expansiveness, and it's not just democratic, he wants to expand concepts. That's why he's eroticizing death in this poem. He wants to say, don't just look at it as, this is life and then we're no longer conscious. He wants to get rid of this notion of death as this end and say, look at this sea, this is death, this is love, this is expansiveness. This is what you know right now, this shore and this bird. But what's in here is actually far greater and beyond what we are capable of understanding. I think that's what he's trying to unite with this rocking back and forth with the sea, the waves, the awareness
That's
of beyond.
Such a great comment, thank you. And while I'm queuing up the last section of the poem, I'll ask the three of you, any one of the three or all three of you, about the role of the sea here. What can you say more about the sea? Why is the sea the site for this portrait of this poet coming to be?
I noticed
Julia?
two things about the sea. One, it's described as hoarse, and it's also described as so I'm not going to find the other word here, but hoarse. It's interesting that the voice of the sea, sort of these like the low rumble of the sea, is being contrasted with the kind of more tonal melodic bird song. And then the other thing I think of in terms of the sea is that it's a kind of cradle. It's something that holds life, and
It's where we all came from.
it's where we all came from. So that connects to Whitman's title. When you think about this cradle that's endlessly rocking, it's never going to stop rocking. It's never going to stop giving birth to new life.
Yeah. Tom, thoughts on the sea and the role of the sea here or in poetry generally?
I'd go along with that, but also just seeing it as something we all like, which is a blank page. It's a big blank canvas. Although obviously the light is continually changing and endlessly fascinating, it's essentially something wonderful to contemplate, out of which you might consider your own mortality and project upon it.
Yeah.
It's a screen.
Yeah. Amy?
Just to play on what Julia was saying is, she's mentioning the fierce old mother is the one that's incessantly moaning in the sea. He's referring to the ocean as the savage old mother incessantly crying. It's like the birthing pains. I think that Whitman, of course, sees this birth and rebirth thing almost like a Mobius strip, and we're only on a little tiny part of it, and the rest of it, is this big expansiveness that we don't know about, that we don't understand. To use a personal analogy, I remember the first time I went snorkeling, I was just put this face mask on and go out there. And then when I started doing it, I was like, oh my God, there's so much stuff below me. I was actually shocked, and I think that's what he wants to get at with this idea of the sea, because it's so full of so much fierceness and hoarseness and,
What I want to do is play a bit of the last section and then ask each of you to throw in a final word. It can either follow from this last section or it can be some other point that you wanted to make that we didn't get to in the discussion. So here's Bunting reading. This will start somewhat into the 10th and final section.
And very plainly before daybreak lisped to me the low and delicious word death. And again, death, 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 hissing, melodious, neither like the bird nor like my aroused child's heart, but edging near, as privately for me, rustling at my feet, creeping thence steadily up to my ears, and laving me softly all over. Death, 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 death. But fuse the song of my dusky demon and brother, that he sang to me in the moonlight on Poem's grey beach, with the 1,000 responsive songs at random, my own songs awaked from that hour, and with them the key, the word up from the waves, the word of the sweetest song and all songs, that strong and delicious word which, creeping to my feet, or like some old crone rocking the cradle, swathed in sweet garments, bending aside, the sea whispered to me.
That was amazing. Clinched the topic. Final words on either on this or anything. Amy, what would you like to add?
I was just making some notes. I can riff on the end of this a bit. I think that you can hear him using death as this urgency, this urgent. We said it's eroticizing. It's like it's death makes us love. It's the thing that says you're not here long. So love, love, love. It's compelling. It represents the impossible. None of us think we're going to die until we do. We can think about it, but actually, I think that's what he wants us to do, is become very aware of that impossibility, because he uses the word demon a few times in this poem, and he uses it at the end, and I think he's using it as in the Greek way of a demon that's a guide for the soul. So he's asking us to be aware, become more aware, question things, and listen louder. And I think the end with the sea whispered me, it's not the sea whispered to me, it's the sea made me, which is, again...
That's so cool.
Why should I be here? I am an impossibility. The sea is destructive. It creates. It's impossible. It's everything. So I think that he's just trying to tie all of this stuff in really neatly at the end.
Yeah. Terrific.
In a compelling and provocative way.
Thank you, Amy. Tom, final word?
I love Dusky Demon and Brother. Do you think I could just read that little last piece, short poem about Basil's death?
Yeah. Do you have it?
Would that? Yeah. To hand.
Okay. To hand.
Yeah. The last bit is just describing the dream of Basil. We stood by the North Sea. A wash swirled around our feet. Furthest from the shore, you stared towards a squall on the dark horizon. I warned against a threatening wave, swelling, it would overwhelm us. Leaping to safety, I glanced back and saw you, steady, silent, still, tracing the trajectory of the wave's engulfing curve. My son's warm hand woke me drowning in a cold sweat. You, the dark spring tide, and the spring were gone.
Tom Pickard, thank you. And the title of that poem is, you told us before...
Springtide for Basil Bunting, 1900.
Thank you. Julia, final word.
I really love how at the end of this poem you get a lot of the ambivalence that I don't feel like I see very frequently in the Whitman that I tend to read. Or if not ambivalence, just kind of an embrace of the contradictions of becoming a poet. When he writes about the unknown want, there's this sense that he was really taken by the sea. He was taken by this birdsong and taken by the sea lapping at him and creating these words. And I think that's also a part of desire. Desire isn't something you always invite or want or feel open to.
Yeah, that's great. My final thought on this combines Amy's point and Tom's poem. when we reach the idea here that the 1,000 responsive songs of Walt Whitman are done at random, it makes me think not only Amy's point and Tom's in the poem thinking about the death of Bunting, and the smallness of human life in connection with the sea, but the randomness of the essential randomness of Whitman's poetics, that at any point you just touch Walt and he will wash up over you, spewing forth something he's meant to say, and it almost is like the ocean. It'll just keep going. You just have to sort of hang around or walk by it and you'll get it. Word up from the waves. I mean, word up is an idiom we use sort of now, but word up from the waves. The whispering, as you put it, the whispering me. It's really quintessential Whitman. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of gathering paradise, to take Dickinson and not Whitman, a phrase, a chance for several of us to spread wide our narrow hands to gather a little something really poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world. Julia, gather some paradise.
I'm gonna recommend one book that I've been reading lately by Erica Lewis, who's a fabulous Oakland-based poet. It's called Murmur in the Inventory, out from Shearsman Books. She read not too long ago here in Philadelphia and completely blew me away. She's also working on some new poems devoted to Daryl Hall, so writing poems about pop culture. Yeah, of Hall & Oates. Writing poems about pop culture is something that's very exciting to me. So please check out Erica Lewis's book, Murmur in the Inventory.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, I'm reading Richard Burton's new biography of Bunting, which came out a couple of months ago. I'd recommend that, if only because... not only because his detective work is rather remarkable, and it does tell Bunting's story in his own words often. And Bunting, himself fought against reaction all his life, and echoing Amy's thought, living in these reactionary times, he's an interesting man. And in which there's that famous letter he wrote to Pound, whom he loved as a poet, chastising him for his racism and so on, at a time when everyone else was falling at his feet.
Thank you, Tom. And that's high praise, because your role in Bunting's later life it's hard to read a biography in which you have a role and then still praise it. So obviously that's a high recommendation. And I'm simply going to recommend one of Tom Pickard's many books. This is More Pricks Than Prizes, and it was published by Pressed Wafer in 2010. And that's all the cautiously peering, absorbing, translating we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks to my guests, Julia Bloch, Amy King, and Tom Pickard. And this would be a perfect time for our live audience to help me thank them, Julia Bloch, Amy King, and Tom Pickard. And to Poem Talk's directors and engineers, plural, today, Chris Martin, Zach Cardiner, and Steve McLaughlin, and to Poem Talk's editor, as always, the just mentioned Steve McLaughlin. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us again soon for another episode of Poem Talk.